Okay, in this set of slides, I'm going to be talking about the distinction between arguments and explanations. And notice that this is part of a series on identifying arguments. So the other videos in the series are listed on this slide. This one is the second in the series. So start out by just reading over these passages. I'll read them out loud verbally and thinking about what is going on in these passages. Is there an argument in both of these passages? Okay, so the first passage reads, "We know that obesity is on the rise in the US because multiple studies carried out by the CDC and NIH have consistently shown a rise in obesity over the last 4 decades." Okay. The second passage reads, "The reason that the rate of obesity is on the rise in the US is that the foods we most often consume over the past 4 decades have increasingly contained high levels of sugar and low levels of dietary fiber. Since eating foods high in sugar and low in fiber triggers the insulin system to start storing those calories as fat, it follows that people who consume foods high in sugar and low in fiber will tend to store more of the calories consumed as fat." Okay, so is there an argument in each of these passages? Here is what I propose to you, and I think with good reason. We should say that the first passage contains an argument. If we look at what follows the word because, it is a reference to studies that have shown certain things, okay, or studies that have certain results or that contain information of a certain kind. And what comes before the because, that is, we know that obesity is on the rise in the US, is intended as something that's supported by that evidence. It's a conclusion that that evidence supports, or that evidence should lead us to believe is true. If we look at the second passage, we see this phrase, "the reason that," which can be a premise indicator, like the word because, which is can be a premise indicator. The reason that can be a premise indicator, but in this case it's not. Look at what it's doing. It's telling us some of the causes of obesity being on the rise in the US. Okay, it says the reason that, another way that could have been put is the cause for the rate of obesity being on the rise in the US is that, and then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so everything else in the passage, everything else in the passage besides the claim the rate of obesity is on the rise in the US, everything else in the passage is intended to provide an explanation of the claim that the rate of obesity is on the rise in the US. Another way to put it is, everything else in the passage is intended to tell us about what's caused this phenomenon of obesity being on the rise. Another way to put it is, everything else in this passage is intended to inform us about what has produced this fact, okay? What's caused this fact, or what's brought it about. That's very different from evidence that's intended to convince us. The second passage is not trying to convince us that the rate of obesity is on the rise in the US. It's not appealing to all these other pieces of information to try to get us to believe that the rate of obesity is on the rise in the US. Okay? And that's really what tells us that it's not an argument for the claim that the rate of obesity is on the rise in the US. It's not an argument for anything. It's an explanation of a claim. It's an explanation of the claim or the fact that the rate of obesity is on the rise in the US. That's very different from providing evidence to believe something. Okay, so this already, just this comparison of these two passages gives us the fundamental difference between arguments and explanations. Now, part of why this is confusing sometimes is that arguments and explanations have a similar structure. Okay, they both have what you could call an A part and a B part. But what the A part and the B part are doing in arguments is different from what the A part and the B part are doing in explanations. Okay, so compare some of these statements on the left-hand side of the screen. You should wash your hands before eating because unwashed hands may carry dangerous bacteria. Here, the claim is trying to, I'm sorry, the passage is trying to convince us something. Some evidence is being offered in support of a conclusion. The conclusion being, of course, you should wash your hands before eating, and the premise or the evidence being unwashed hands may carry dangerous bacteria. Now look on the right-hand side of the screen, the passage. He probably got sick because he didn't wash his hands before eating. It's not that he didn't wash his hands before eating, which would be the sort of analog of the what follows the because on the left-hand side of the screen, the A part, okay? If the A part is he didn't wash his hands before eating, and the B part is he probably got sick, it's not that the A part is being offered as evidence for the B part, right? It's not that the A part is presented to try to convince us of the B part. Rather, in that passage, passage 3 here on the right-hand side of the slide, it's pretty clear that whoever it is that wrote this statement or uttered this statement is taking it as assumed that he got sick, and he or she is assuming that the reader or the listener will also know that he got sick. So it's not that him getting sick is somehow up for contention and that it needs to be argued for. It's rather being assumed to be true. And what follows the because is a explanation for why that happened. The A part of an argument, we already know, is called the premises of the argument, and the B part of an argument is called its conclusion. We have a terminology that we can also use for describing the A part and the B part of explanations. We call the A part the explanans. This is basically whatever it is that is provided as an explanation, whatever it is that does the explaining. And a B part, the explanandum, which is the thing explained, or the thing that is explained by the A part. Okay, take a moment to identify the A part and the B part of items 1 through 4, and then when you're done, I will give you the answers. And if you can, also just note whether you think that that passage is an argument or an explanation. In a way, I've already given you these answers more or less pretty directly, but I think it would be useful for you to just try looking at the slide to identify the A part and the B part and say whether the passage is an argument or an explanation. And when you start the video again, then I'll give you the answers. Okay, here are the answers. Hopefully you didn't have too much trouble identifying the A part and the B part of 2 and 4, which we hadn't done yet on the previous slides. Okay, in this slide I've given some additional information about the differences between arguments and explanations, as well as summarize some of the distinctions that have been mentioned so far, particularly the distinction about the aim, the different aim of an argument versus an explanation. So I won't go into any further detail about this slide, but you can read over this and think about this, and maybe some of these things will help you to identify arguments or explanations. Okay, let's do one final exercise before ending this video. So take a moment, in just a moment, to pause the video and to try to do 2 things for each of these sentences. Identify the A part and the B part, and then secondly, say whether that passage expresses an argument or an explanation. So go ahead and write this one out. Make sure you're writing out your answers, and then when you start the video again, I'll give you the correct answers. Okay, here are the correct answers. So the first is pretty clearly an explanation, and here's the A part and the B part listed on the slide. The second is pretty clearly an argument, and here's the A part and the B part. One of the clues that this is an argument is the word should. that shows up in what ends up being the conclusion here, or the B part. And this is a sign that the passage is intended to convince someone of something, which is what arguments are by definition trying to do. They're trying to provide evidence for some conclusion. And so the second passage here, one can notice, partly based on that word should that appears in it, the second passage counts as an argument rather than an explanation. Now the third one is a little tricky. It actually turns out that you can read this passage as either an argument or an explanation. And I hope, that's sometimes frustrating when I come to this point in discussing arguments and explanations. What's important, or what makes it the case that some passages can be either arguments or explanations, is that we don't really have the context around that statement. We don't know we don't know who is saying the passage in 3. We don't know who's saying the dog might be injured because he got in a fight. And it depends on what they're saying and what they're intending to say with that string of words, whether or not this passage counts as an argument or an explanation. I don't expect that to really give you much clarity about this yet, but in the next video I'm actually going to look more closely at exactly this example to try to explain how it is that some passages can be either arguments or explanations depending on the context. Okay, I'm going to stop the video now, and in the next video, as I said, we'll look at an example to explain how it is that some passages can be read either as arguments or as explanations depending on the context.